Hello and welcome to the brand new American Reformation podcast. We long to see the wider American Christian church fall more in love with Jesus by learning from the practices of the early church and other eras of discipleship multiplication. We want to hear from you. Make sure you comment and leave a review wherever you're watching or listening to tell us what God is doing in your life or how you feel about today's conversation. Lord, have your way in us. Let's dive in.
Welcome to the American Reformation Podcast. Tim Allman here. I pray that you're leaning into growing today, that the right-hand side of your brain, the relational connection, the joy of Jesus, the Hesed love that comes from knowing you are unconditionally loved by the God of the universe by grace through faith in Jesus Christ, and you've been connected to the greatest mission of all time, which is making him known in word and deed. Today, you're in for a treat. We have a brand new friend of mine who was connected to me by Matt Peoples. Shout out to Matt Peoples. He's been on American Reformation a number of times, and this is Pastor Eric Hoke. Now, I got to tell you a little bit about Eric before we get in. He's a decade-long church planner in the Bronx, and he has this ministry that is unbelievable. If you've been connected to the United Leadership Collective for any number of months or years, you know that we have a strong desire to see more bi-vocational leaders raised up within local congregations. And a lot of times the mechanisms or the pathways for recognizing the need for bi-vocational ministry, from house churches to maybe smaller churches, the mechanisms in the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod are not necessarily there. So one of our missions is to highlight the need for bivocational ministers. And Eric has an amazing ministry that he started out as kind of a side gig with 3 to 4 pastors. And over the last number of years, it's grown to serving 20 to 40 bivocational pastors at any time. So welcome, Eric, and share a little bit more of your ministry story. And before you do that, standard question, how are you praying for Reformation in the American Christian church? Thanks for hanging with me today, Eric.
And thank you so much, Tim. And the way that I'm praying for Reformation in the American church is, as you said, I spent the last 10 years in the South Bronx in New York City. New York City is an amazing, complicated place to live and do ministry. One of the things that makes it complicated and amazing is that it is a post-Christian city. So, I mean, you have, immigrant churches, and you have that coming in, which helps keep the scaffolding clear for the faith of New Yorkers. But at baseline, there's no social capital to go into church in New York City. You don't talk to your coworkers about what your preacher talked about on Sunday. That's just not part of the culture. And one of the things that's a unintended consequence, but a benefit of that, is that Christians are not tribal. So I have 3 children, 5, 3, and 1. My 5-year-old Lydia has been to every sort of church you can imagine. From, yesterday we went to an all-black Pentecostal church to support a friend of mine who planted a church up in Yonkers, New York. Shout out to Pastor Kevin. So they've been to experiences like that. They've been to Episcopal and Catholic and Anglican churches. They've been to Methodist and Baptist and Presbyterian churches and everything in between. And to my 5-year-old and my other daughters as well, church is just church, and God's people are just God's people. And I love that innocence in them that they don't have. I mean, they're still kids, of course, but they don't have that sense of like, oh, well, they're not the true Christians or the real Christians or the spiritual Christians like we are. So I'm praying that more people can be like my 5-year-old, and they can just say, hey, we're all God's people. We're all figuring it out. We all might have slightly different expressions of what that means, but if Jesus is Lord, we can all agree to that creed and doctrine. We're all on the same team, baby. So let's make it happen.
It appears as if Jesus said something about that, Eric.
Yeah.
If you do not receive the kingdom of God like a little child, you'll never enter it. Yeah, I can say more.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, man. I mean, one of the things that I do, I come from a kind of the Baptist evangelical world, but for the past 3 years, I've been going to a Benedictine monastery for a retreat every year for my birthday in the end of March, which is in upstate New York, Mount Savior Monastery, for those who are interested. And it's funny because last time I went with my executive pastor, Elazar. We're both like young pastors. I'm in my 30s. He's in his like late 20s, early 30s at the time. And for some reason, the monks thought we were both priests. And all weekend, they just were treating us like priests. And we told them, no, we're not priests. We're both, evangelical pastors. And they're like, not like they were mad or offended. We never like lied to them. They just assumed we were priests. Mostly priests go there. But just 2 single guys. And then the one monk, Brother Bruno, who's probably 70 years old, was like, oh, it's okay. We all worship the same God. And I was like, yeah, fair point, Brother Bruno. God, you're right.
True. Yeah. I mean, as you see the world going the way that we're, and this is just from the beginning of our rebellion, the world has been decelerating away from the promises of God. And the more we kind of see this, and obviously I wrote I'm preaching this upcoming week on the impact of technology, so much to say there. Do you think technology has increased our tribalism? Because like social media, you can like find in our denomination, Luther Church Missouri Synod, a conservative, confessing, historic, really our roots go back to the Catholic Church, and then
Hmm.
obviously through the story of the Reformation 500 years ago. But I don't think social media and technology in general has increased our unity capital, our joy capital as the church. Anything to say there? I think it's increased tribalism. Go ahead, Eric.
Yeah, I mean, 100%. I mean, this is not a Christian show at all, but Netflix has a series called Black Mirror. And in the most recent season, there's an episode, I forget which one it's called, but it's called Someone is the Worst. And basically, the premise of the show is it follows a woman around showing all the bad parts of her life as like a Netflix show. And one of the interesting narratives in that storyline was we try to make it positive. It was like, so it was always like the negative things she did, but like expanded. And they said, oh, when we're doing market research, we try to make it positive, like paint her in the best light possible. But I think as many reviews, or as many clicks, or as many eyeballs, people want to see the dumpster fires. And I can certainly attest that I've been guilty of that in my own life as well. I mean, I open Twitter and it's a dumpster fire. And that's just, but you feel like you're sucked into it. I just got off vacation last week. I was visiting the Poconos with my parents and was off any social media for the whole entire week. And believe it or not, Tim, I was happier and more fulfilled and more joyful and more patient and more loving and all the things that Jesus calls us to be.
You just got to call it out, man. We are not accelerating in terms of our character, and we're not connected to one another. It's false connection. Like
Mhm.
I want to be where the people are. I want to be like with real people in real time, talking about real stuff going on in our real lives, the ups and downs of our lives, and it's just fake. Some people can find connection, and it has some benefit, I guess. But talk about the church and the role of the church providing that hesed, that loving community connection. This is where the church is, where people are gathered to hear His word and then to live out His word in real time, in real context, with folks walking through the ups and downs. So talk about this that need for close connection, and then weave that, if you would, into your bivocational ministry story, if you would, Eric. Awesome.
Yeah, man. Thank you so much. Gosh, where to start? Well, I guess I'll start with this angle and then we'll kind of unpack from here. But COVID-19, I feel like this experience for the collective world was like a before COVID, after COVID life. And before COVID, I think in my faith community, I realized that people didn't come to church, much to my, bruised ego, to hear me preach. They came to church because they wanted to see their friends. They wanted to be in community. They wanted to go out for lunch. They wanted to share their ups and downs with somebody. And then, when COVID came, New York City locked down probably tighter than anywhere else in the country did. So we couldn't have a service. And there was not just restrictions, it was also because of where we meet and what have you. We couldn't have an actual physical service for 20 months. Everything was digital on Zoom. And it was just, of course, it wasn't the same. Nobody would say it was the same. But it was really an apparent thing to me, living in a place like New York City, that if somebody wants a high production show, they can go to Broadway. They can see the best production in the world, quite literally. But they don't come to church for that. They come to church because their friends are there, their family is there, people who know them and love them and care about them are there. And this quote by Tim Keller, and Tim Keller's how me and that people's met. And he says, if you're a small church pastor, they let you preach because you pastor them, right? And if you're a big church pastor, they let you pastor them because you preach to them. So I found if church is nothing more than just disseminating information from the stage, you can do that from home. And there's someone better than you online that can do that as well. But when you actually have someone who loves and cares and is on mission with you, that makes the world of a difference. So me as a bivocational guy, I could stand in front of my congregation on a Sunday and say, listen, I get it. Tomorrow I have my quarterly review with my manager. I missed some of my goals and my KPI. I'm really stressed out. I don't know how it's going to go. So please pray for me as I go through that. And the person sitting there can say, oh, yeah, I get that too. I've had, the pressure of not performing at the highest level at my job and being concerned about my job security as well. It just makes you a lot more relatable because you're on mission with people every single day, Monday through Saturday. And then on Sundays, when you come together, you fellowship, you enjoy, you give life to each other, you hear the word of God, you take the elements, all that good stuff.
That's awesome, bro. I think the future and maybe the present, actually, just given the demographics of the American Christian church, is going to be smaller rather than larger, more small pockets, what we think of as small groups in our context. I'm privileged to pastor in our denomination a mega church. We worship 800 people to 1,000 seasonal, right? But I totally agree with that. Like, they're letting me preach because I'm a pastor here, because in the big scheme of things, that's not, and I'm a passionate guy. I love to, but I realize that the primary benefit is the courtyard time afterwards and the groups going out to get coffee or lunch afterwards. So I think the future, and then we've got a couple other smaller multi-sites, worshiping 80 people or so. And I think that's going to be a little bit more of the standard. So would you go into the necessity for bi-vocational? Because in our context, we've got a lot of bi-vocational students. Some of them in time will be ordained as pastors, God willing. So, what's your perspective on the necessity of bivocational ministry today, Eric?
Yeah, I feel like I have a unique vantage point because I think culturally what happens in places like New York and LA, San Francisco, these are kind of canaries in the coal mine culturally. I'm originally from Pennsylvania. I was actually in Pennsylvania this past week on vacation, like I said. As we were driving to one of the water parks with our kids, I commented to my wife, I said, I can't believe how many mega churches there are. And maybe not even mega, but 500 north, churches, big churches, large parking lots, big signage, all the fancy stuff. And such a rural part of the country. Where do all these people draw from? This is insane. Whereas in cities, it's the opposite. You have these high rise buildings. You have these, 30, 40 story low income housing projects. And when I was doing my kind of market research to prepare for planting All Saints Church in 2017, I had realized the largest non-Catholic church, there's a lot of Hispanics in my community, so Catholicism is the largest, denomination. Largest non-Catholic, so evangelical church was 75 adults. And this is in a zip code of 50,000 people. And there's a million and one reasons for that. But the biggest one, I think, is obviously space. It's hard to come by space that people at churches can afford based on the tithes and offerings of a congregation. And then the second one is the transience. People come and go in a place like New York very often. When I was a youth pastor in New Jersey, before planting my own church, I went back there a year ago. I had not been there in over a decade. And the church was 95% the same people. Whereas, my church plant in the Bronx, it was basically a new congregation every 3 years. Not because people got offended at me, even though some of them did, but most of it was just because I'm moving, my job has changed, I'm going to a different part of the state or the city, what have you. So with that being said, I don't know the exact numbers, but I want to say the average size church in all of America, not just the inner city, is less than 50 people. And that's not a massive group of people. That's what, a dozen families or so. So to expect that those dozen families to fund you as a pastor, especially if you have a wife and you have children, their medical bills, what have you, it's just really a challenging thing to do. And I think a lot of pastors are kind of waking up and realizing, wait a second, if I'm a 30-year-old or 40-year-old and I've got a young family and I'm making below the minimum wage, a bus driver in my school district makes more money than I do as a pastor, this kind of sucks. I have no benefits. I can't keep doing this, and I want to find a different path. So I'm sorry if I can't say this kind of sucks on your podcast, but I just did.
No,
it's
okay.
Suck
is fine.
All right, suck is okay. Oh, it's been approved. Okay, just avoid the other letters, right? But I think that a lot of pastors are realizing in 2023, hey, it's not 1980 anymore. I can't go, work at a church of 200, 300 people and make a, middle class life. It's just not really sustainable. So I help pastors get jobs as a ministry. And by God's grace, we help pastors with ministry sustainability without money stress. And we do that through a co-vocational model.
So say more. I use bi-vocational. You just use co-vocational. Talk about the difference between bi and co.
Yeah,
I've heard that thrown around. Yeah.
Yeah, the easiest way to describe it in so many words is bi-vocational is I work because I have to. So I am a pastor of a church. My church is small. Maybe it's a church startup. We can't afford for me to have a full-time salary. So I'm going to go be a substitute teacher. I'm going to go be a barista at Starbucks. I'm going to go do X, Y, and Z. And then once my church gets big enough, then I'm going to quit this day job and be a full-time pastor. I'm bivocational. Co-vocational is I work because I want to. And I view my job as an extension of my everyday ministry. And even if the church could afford to pay me tomorrow, I would still keep my job because this is part of my ministry. So I would self-identify as a co-vocational pastor. So even if my church was able to pay me my salary tomorrow, I still would keep my job because it's an opportunity for me to minister Monday through Friday. And it also frees me up to equip the saints to do the work of the ministry. I was a full-time pastor for 5 years. I enjoyed it. There's certainly benefits to it. But at the same time, there is that pressure that, I'm the one who's paid to be here and I'm the one that's paid to do this. So I found it personally, not everyone does, harder to delegate, harder to give away, harder to empower, harder to equip the saints to do the work of the ministry as we're called to do. Ephesians 4:12, as a co-vocational or bivocational pastor, you kind of have to. You don't have much of a choice. You've got limited time, energy, and bandwidth. So it's more of a team approach to doing the ministry, which is something I found to be very beneficial and also a lot of fun.
Eric, that makes so much sense, man. And we've walked alongside a lot of pastors, and in our denomination, like I've said, co-vocational, even bivocational, is not something we talk about an awful lot. You've gone through 4 years of undergrad likely, and then maybe 4 years of seminary. You may have a little bit of debt if you've gone in with a family. I mean, you've made maybe some major life sacrifices to go residential seminary. And so you kind of come out where you're like, hey, I put in all this time. I'm entitled, if you will, to, in a sense, to this kind of full-time role. And then, if you don't have people on a board or a group of elders or partners, it's really easy to move into the doer rather than the developer mindset. And I've never really wrapped my head as much around the economical reality and this kind of, you're being paid to do it, and how much of a struggle, I guess I have, but just how much of a struggle that is to make that shift from doer to developer. But for a co-vocational guy or gal, it's just in your blood. It has to happen, right? And as I think of a number of the folks that are co-vocational here, and thank you for the definition, because I'll switch some of my language, because we have way more co-vocational leaders than bivocational. They're going to stay in the marketplace. That's a major part of their ministry. And they, by nature, develop people more naturally. So I've seen it in spades, man. Anything else to add to that?
Yeah, man. I think the biggest thing is there is a stigma in every denomination that I'm aware of where, when are you going to be a real pastor? When are you going to have a real church? And you're not really a real pastor with a real church until it's your full-time job. And the thing I always want to push back against that is if you look at church history and even the international church, co-vocational, bivocational is the norm. Those of us who've had the privilege to be full-time, we're the minority. And thank God that we have the ability to do that. But like you said, Tim, you're spot on to think you're going to go to, 4 years undergrad, 3 years seminary, move your family, graduate with $60,000 more in debt, and that you're just going to waddle into a church making, $80,000 a year with great health insurance because it's your right as a person is, a little bit foolish. I hate to use that word, but I don't know what else to call it.
So you're walking through, get a little bit more, because we may have some people that want to reach out to you, Eric, to navigate the ministry. Is it a name? Is it just an organic thing that's just kind of taken off relationally? Say more about your ministry.
Yeah, man. So the ministry is called, kept it really simple for people because, we pastors, we like things simple. It's called I Help Pastors Get Jobs. And basically, the domain, ihelppastorsgetjobs.com. And essentially the way it works is we help ministers and ministry professionals rebrand and remessage their skills in a way that makes sense to hiring managers. Because you can't submit a resume. You're a handsome guy, Tim, but with your face, and it says Pastor Tim Allman, top skills, discipleship, preaching. You can't put that and then go get a job at, XYZ Corporation. They're going to think, who in the world is this guy? Yeah. Right? So what we do is we help pastors think through, hey, you didn't you didn't lead Bible studies, you did event planning. You didn't preach, you communicated to stakeholders. You didn't, manage a board, you managed a budget and a leadership team. Things of that nature. Just again, remessaging and rebranding. And the cool thing about it is that we have a business model. I've always admired Louis von Ahn, who's the founder of Duolingo. Louis always says, I would never want cost to be a barrier for someone to not learn a language, because there's so many benefits to learning other languages. So I help pastors get jobs. About 97% of the folks who engage us don't pay a penny. They can get our email newsletter. They can get our free PDF. We have free videos they can watch. They don't pay a penny. And then there's 3% of the pastors who decide to, invest a little bit of their money because they really want to make a move. And they can either do a master class, which is 9 hours of me sharing kind of the best practices to go from A to Z on how to rebrand yourself as a marketplace professional. And I joke around that it took me 9 years to figure it out. I'll teach you it in 9 hours. So it's a pretty good deal. So that's like the most entry level basic tier. One tier above that is what I call resume rewrite, which is when a pastor will say, I really want this job. Can you go ahead and make me a resume tailored to this job? And it's been a really amazing thing, because we'll have pastors who apply to 100 jobs, get 0 callbacks, shell out for a resume, apply to 3 jobs, and get 3 callbacks within a day or 2. And it's not because there's any magic potion in the resume. It's just knowing how to use the right words and the right language that, makes sense to the person receiving it. And the final tier is kind of all that: the class, the resume, a cover letter, and then a coaching call with me, where I sit down with the pastor and say, here's how you kind of dial in your LinkedIn. Let's practice some interview questions. Let's really spend time really getting to know each other, figure out where your, weaknesses are, and make them stronger. And interviews are a big one, because interviewing for a marketplace job and interviewing for a pastoral job are worlds apart. And in a lot of ways, they're actually in complete tension. So learning how to kind of untangle those is really critical for a pastor who wants to transition.
Dude, I love this. Like, this is good. How long have you been doing this?
This launched March 2022, so a year and a half.
I don't think I'm pretty well connected. Is anybody else doing this, Eric?
Well, I
haven't heard of.
Yeah, I have a day job. So my co-vocational job is with a workforce development organization where I train 18 to 29-year-olds from underserved communities to get jobs at JP Morgan, Bank of America, Salesforce, Meta, what have you. And one day the light bulb went off in my head. You know what? There's a lot of programs like this for underserved people. There's a lot of programs like this for veterans. But who helps pastors when they want to change careers? And I just, I called Steve Pike. You guys have Steve Pike on our show a few weeks ago. I like to listen to that one. He's a mentor of mine, a friend. I called Brad Briscoe. I'm not sure if you know him. He's the director of Co-vocational ministry for North American Mission Board, which is my background. And then I called Robert Elkin, who works for Redeemer City to City. And I'm like, hey, man, I have this really crazy idea. Help pastors rebrand for marketplace professionals, explore co-vocational ministry. I know somebody smarter and richer and more handsome is already doing it. Tell me who it is so I can just reach out to them and see how I can support them. Brad, Steve, Robert were like, no one that I know is doing that. You'd be the first. And I think I still am the first and only person that actually just helps pastors only, rebrand, and here's how you get a marketplace job.
Eric, you're an entrepreneur, bro. There are few people like you who say, because creativity is taking 2 existing ideas and just bringing them together. Mm-hmm. The church is evolving. We all know, pastors, the church is closing and all of that. Like, let's care for our brothers, and for those who have women in ministry, ordained women in ministry too. Mm-hmm. It's really, really powerful. So let's dig into the theology of co-vocational, bi-vocational. You referenced scripture and even history. Mm-hmm. Some folks who leveraged co-vocational and bi-vocational ministry. What are some of your primary examples?
Yeah, so I'm not going to say Paul because everybody says Paul, so we'll skip over him today. Tent maker, kind of an easy answer. But I'm going to talk about Lydia, who was, of course, one of Paul's accomplices and helpers in ministry. She was a businesswoman. She had a dealer in purple cloths, but she was also a woman who feared God, and she used her wealth. She hosted, a church in her home. And she was somebody who had a lot to give in ministry, though she was never, a full-time pastor or in vocational ministry. She was somebody who used her skills in entrepreneurship, which I'm sure came in handy for starting the church. She used her home in hospitality, which was massive. And she also, we could have some evidence, helped fund Paul's ministry. Like, she was one of his donors. And it's pretty phenomenal. Think about that God used her, because I'm afraid in a lot of our churches, we would say to Lydia, okay, go to seminary and get ordained and go and become a full-time pastor for God to use you. She'd be like, wait, but I think God is using me. Maybe not in that way, but in this special way. The other thing I'll share is more of a modern example. So after Bible college, I went to Liberty for undergrad. I spent 3 months in South Africa and Zambia as a missionary. And while I was in Zambia, I worked with the Brethren Church. And one of the unique things about the Brethren Church is they have, at least in that context, all of their pastors were co-vocational, and they would actually have 4 pastors, all of which had day jobs. And each one would kind of oversee a different domain of ministry. So one was the family guy, one was the outreach guy, one was the, mercy and justice guy, and one was like the finance guy. They each took a turn preaching, one per month essentially, but they all had their kind of departments they oversaw. And it was pretty amazing because they had a pretty, large church. I want to say north of 200 or 300 people without a single paid staff member. But 4 kind of volunteer pastors that had teams who had teams who had teams. And I also see that here in the inner city as well with Spanish Pentecostal churches. You'll see all these, churches that have multiple pastors on staff, all of whom are volunteer. So you call that vocational. Yes, you're completely volunteer pastor. But they're able to equip the saints, like we said earlier, to kind of maximize ministry. There is no solo pastor model, which I think is pretty profound. And I would probably wager to say is probably more biblical as well.
Yeah, dude, I agree with you on so many things. And I know we're just getting to know one another, but for those of you who have listened to this for a while, sometimes I feel like I pull out my hair a little bit because of our very narrow understanding of what formation looks like. We even use in our denomination the gold standard of seminary training is residential. And I may say, okay, if you can, if it's the right season of life, I think it's great, but we're making a case that it shouldn't be kind of the only. We don't have in our denomination an online MDiv, and so we're running a test with, again, out of our now I have new language, not bi-vocational, co-vocational pastors in our context, and we're hoping it gets observed with curiosity rather than condemnation by our church body. We'll see how that will go. So along those lines, what should seminary, or in your experience, what has seminary education, theological formation look like for co-vocational pastors?
Yeah, I mean, I had the traditional route, Tim. I went to a residential seminary, Nyack College. I'm grateful for that. I think it was formative. Yep. I also recognize I'm a person of immense privilege. I'm a person that had the means to uproot my life and relocate for seminary. I had a wife who was a nurse that made a lot of money. We didn't have any children at the time. So if you were to say to me now as a man who's 36 years old with 3 kids, hey, uproot your life and go to seminary in another part of the country, I'd be like, yeah, that's not going to happen. Sorry, it's not in the cards for me. But at the time it did. I think City to City, where Matt Peoples and I met, is a really good example of what training can look like. So they have a program called the Incubator with bi-vocational pastors. They do it for full-time pastors as well. But it's a cohort of ministers who are serving in real time. So these are not people who are just, starting out. They have a ministry. It could be a senior pastor. It could be an associate pastor. It could be a church planter. But they meet once a month, normally in the evenings. I think they swap it between online and in person. I'm not sure how they're doing it currently, but that's how they were doing it when I was familiar with them. And they'll do like projects, they do papers, they do readings, they do all the things you would kind of imagine a seminary does. The cool thing with them too is that they do it at no cost. And I mean, granted, they're City to City, they're Redeemer Presbyterian Church, they're Tim Keller, they have a lot of money, a lot of influence, a lot of all that stuff. But it's pretty phenomenal that they have the ability to train pastors, not just Presbyterian pastors, not just PCA church planters in New York City, but of every denomination and stripe you can imagine, at no cost to the student. And it's accessible. Wow. It's contextual. It's in the evenings and weekends for the co-vocational guys. There's nothing worse than seeing a church. I've seen this before. It's so funny. They'll see like a denomination say, "We love our co-vocational planters. Join us for a bi-vocational lunch on Thursday at 12 p.m." It's like, yeah, I'll be at work. I'm not going to be able to make that one. So I think that's a really good example of how you can train co-vocational leaders. It's kind of that more hybrid delivery model, evenings and weekends, low cost, stay in your context, but let's do it while you're on mission. Let's not pump you full of theory and then send you out. Let's train you in real time.
Have you heard of Kairos University? not Matt Peoples' Kairos Network, but
No, I don't know them.
Kairos University. Yeah, it's something to take a look at too, because does that offer a degree of any sorts, or it's more like a certification
Yeah,
program,
more like a
right?
certification. Like I'm like a Redeemer City to City incubator graduate. Yeah.
Yeah. So the cool thing about Kairos University is you could go through city to city, but then because it's a competency-based theological education, a life experience, as well as whatever learning model or community you are in, counts toward respectively filling up your 9 outcomes for a Master of Divinity degree. So it may be something to look and partner, because some people,
Totally.
like in our denomination, a degree actually matters, and internationally, a lot of times a degree actually matters. So yeah, there's so many ways, asynchronous models, synchronous models, etc., that we can offer really, really high quality theological formation that works for bi-vo and co-vocational leaders, as well as those who are going to be full time in a church into the future. So good. Let's pivot a little bit and start talking about coaching, because you're doing coaching, and I think there's a revolution that's going on right now in terms of the coaching space, which is different than say being a consultant, right? I'm going to tell you what to do. Coaches come alongside, ask questions to lead toward that individual taking their right next step to do whatever it is the Lord has kind of called them to do. So what are some of your basic concepts in your coaching ministry there, Eric?
Yeah, so the I Help Pastors Get Jobs has 5 frameworks. Kind of tease out these 5 frameworks to help the pastor whatever step they're in their journey. So I'll kind of go over those high level and then kind of share how I would tease those out in a coaching session. So the first one is mindset. Basically, that's the foundation. If you have a mindset that says, "Oh, I'm becoming a bivocational pastor," or "I'm moving to the marketplace because I'm a failure in ministry," you're never gonna get a job. You're never gonna show up well in interviews. You're never gonna lead with your best foot forward. So we have to really kind of untangle, the mindset. Like, hey, you're doing this because this is what God has called you to. He's released you to. You're not quitting your ministry. You're extending and expanding your ministry, and that is really a humongous hurdle for pastors, and rightfully so. There's so much identity that goes into being a pastor, Tim, as we both are well aware, that when people either step back to go become a part-time pastor or leave ministry altogether, it's a lot that they're processing and dealing with. So mindset is the first one. The second one is discovery. We as pastors, we spend so much time just playing defense, responding to the needs of people. So-and-so's in the hospital. So-and-so is upset because this volunteer didn't show up. So-and-so's mad because we didn't play their worship song on Sunday. So-and-so's, passed away. And there's a million reasons why we're constantly playing defense. And I know that in my experience as a pastor, I didn't spend very much time asking myself, how's God made Eric Hoke? How am I wired? What fires me up? What excites me? What are my giftings? What are my skills? I spend so much time putting out fires. I don't even know who I am as a person removed from being a helper to other people. So we spend a lot of time in discovery, like how's God made you specifically removed from a pastor? The third is rebrand.
Can we pause on discovery real quick before we go rebrand? So do you use assessments at all? Any kind of assessments to help with that discovery process?
So we have a 4 kind of jobs we recommend for pastors to kind of explore based on the way that God has wired them. They are learning and development, project management, sales, or nonprofits. We call it the heart, head, hands, feet framework. And we kind of ask, like, okay, are you like a empathetic, caring person? Do you love hospital visits and sitting with the sick, visiting shut-ins? Heart, you probably should look at not-for-profit. You probably would not enjoy going and doing a sales job somewhere because you have a huge compassionate heart. Head, are you cerebral, academic? Do you love learning? Do you love reading? Do you love teaching? Consider a job in learning and development. That's how I cut my teeth into co-vocational ministry and marketplace work, is I became a learning and development coach. The last one is third one's hands, project management. You like tinkering with things, you like fixing things, you like managing multiple demands. That's how you're wired. You like being in that kind of high octane leadership role. Project management should be a great path to pursue. And the last one is the feet. You like movement, you like chasing things down, you don't mind knocking on doors. Get into sales. And we have pastors. It's pretty phenomenal, Tim. We have one guy in New Orleans, church planter, got into software as a service, SaaS sales. He texted me that he was going to make $21,000 in the month of December. And I'm like, I think you mean like the last quarter, right? Like, like last 3 months. Like, no, like in 1 month, I'm going to make 20 grand. I was like, oh, shoot, is your company hiring? Like, it's like, and he was, a church planter making, maybe 50 grand 3 or 4 months prior. And he kept his church as well. He's doing both. So that's sort of the assessment that we use for discovery. How's God wired you based on these kind of 4 jobs? And then within them are different avenues you can explore. So that's that. Yeah.
That's spectacular. I love that framework. So continue on. The third thing you do, you help pastors rebrand. Talk about brand.
Yeah.
A lot of times in the church, Eric, brand is seen as a bad word, right? A church's brand or a personal brand. So how do you even help work through that reconcept of a brand? I wonder if you've ever had any pushback about brand connected to church. Go ahead.
Yeah, of course I have, because you know how we pastors are. We can be stubborn when it comes to stuff like that. But I oftentimes say, it's like, listen, it's not a matter of trying to sell yourself. It's a matter of positioning yourself in the best possible light. And if you, I don't know, let's just say you're in the mood for tacos, but I take you to a burger place. You'd be like, well, Eric, I said I wanted tacos. Why are we at a burger place? I said, I don't know. Burgers and tacos are both food. Let's just go get burgers instead. But I wanted tacos, right? So if you give a ministry resume, churchy answers, everything's through the lens of being a pastor and not kind of rebranding yourself to be a taco instead of a hamburger, no matter how tasty you might be, so to speak, you're never going to secure the job, because like we're trying to hire a person that does this, not a person that does that. So that's the whole rebrand pillar in the framework. The fourth one is the interview. Kind of as I shared earlier, a church interview and a corporate interview are radically different in many different ways. I think the easiest way to kind of untangle all that is that in a church interview, they're really looking for humility, which is good. You want your pastor to be someone who's humble. But in a corporate interview, a marketplace interview, they want confidence. They want someone that can walk in there and say, like, I can do this job. I have the ability to do so. So we really help pastors untangle that.
What is let's pause there. What is that about church culture that I think is imbalanced toward humility? And humility maybe being more the personality, because you can be humble and confident at the same time. You know who you are in Christ, and then you speak out of that clarity, that confidence of self, your identity in Jesus. And I think just talk through. So I'm at a church that wanted Tim Allman to step in to lead. You know what I'm saying? Like, I didn't have to put on a veneer, put on a mask to come in and take this like low place of great men. I came in my interview process. I've been here 10 years now, dude. So it's hard for me to even like get my mind wrapped around the headhunting approach that Christ Greenfield actually utilized to go after me as an associate pastor in Denver, coming down here to Phoenix. It was definitely much more, I think it was atypical is what I'm trying to get after, to how most churches kind of do it. So talk about that need for the humble, kind of lowly pastor and how that is, again, so much different than kind of the way the secular world does it. Because I think the church has something to learn here as it relates to that first article reality in our secular world. Go ahead.
Yeah, man. It's funny. It's like we want like a lot of churches will say we want a visionary leader that brings change as long as it doesn't impact my life. Right. And I think a lot of churches, like they stay small and they stay stagnant because they psychologically want things to change. They want new families to come. They want baptisms. They want growth. They want salvations. They want all the things that we celebrate as churches. But as long as it doesn't inconvenience them or cause their life any pain or stress, and they can have their church exactly how they've always liked it for the past however long years. I think that this is probably more of a challenge in smaller churches, stagnant churches that aren't looking to innovate and change and grow, which are most churches that I've experienced, most pastors I work with. They're coming from context that says, hey, I was at this 150-year-old congregation. They just wanted things to kind of stay the same. They just wanted someone to push the buttons and preach sermons and visit us in the hospital, and that was it. So I think that kind of humility, like, yes, I'll come and I'll be your obedient servant, just give me a tithe so I can feed my family, is where that comes from. And you're right. In the marketplace, they're assessing you on your competencies, on your skills. What have you done that's similar to what you'll be doing here? Because hiring is all about risk, fundamentally, right? And we want to mitigate our risk as much as possible to make sure we're hiring the right person. And that's why we want to, really fact check, is this the right person for the job?
It's so good, man. Anything else as it relates to what you work folks through?
Yeah, the last one is sustainability. And I think this is one that gets kind of overlooked is like, what's your relationship with your church going to be now that you're bivocational or co-vocational? Because if you keep doing everything you did as a full-time pastor while having a full-time job, you're going to burn out in about 3 to 6 months and you're going to hurt a lot of people in the wake. So you have to start thinking now, what do I need to change and adjust and kind of massage to make this sustainable for the long term? Who do I need to raise up? Who do I need to train? Who do I need to fill in the gaps that I can't do anymore? One of the things that I did that was smart in my journey as a church planter is I was always a co-pastor with another bivocational pastor. And he and I could tag team preaching. We could each take vacations in the summer. We could each take a sabbatical after 5 years because we had each other. And that was massive because sometimes he had it in him to do something for the church that I didn't, and vice versa. It also was a huge benefit because I had a traditional 8 to 5 job in Lower Manhattan and he was a bartender. So I was kind of like the day shift pastor and he was kind of the night shift pastor. So it worked out pretty well.
You look at the Bible and they did things together. I mean, the easy stories, Luke 9 and then Luke 10, the sending of the 12 and then the 70 sent out 2 by 2. And I think we've overlooked that as it relates to leadership within the church, how we need to have a partner pastor. I'm the lead senior, blah, blah, blah. We don't really use that language. I've got a partner pastor now who is a pastor for me and has stepped in. He's newer on our team, has stepped in here the last year. And we go back about a decade now as friends. And it's really fun to do life and ministry with friends. And I just feel so bad. I mean, truly, man, for guys, whether you're full-time or co or bivocational, guys that just feel like, man, I'm all alone here. And Sunday's coming and I got to preach another. And then, and then if you throw in, I got an 8 to 5 job, I can just see how that would get just overwhelming. Anything more to say about the need to do it with other people, not for other people, Eric?
Yeah, man, I would just say the best advice is that if you are serious about exploring this path of being co-vocational and you don't have someone to do it with, you should wait. I would not advise any pastor to say, I'm just going to continue being a solo pastor while working a full-time job. It's a recipe for disaster because it is so, like you said, Tim, it can be so frustrating, so exhausting, so many demands on my time, my energy. I don't have anyone to lean on. But when you have that one person or that team of people that you can count on and you're all together, working together, it makes, like I said earlier in the interview, a lot more fun, a lot more enjoyable to do ministry that way.
I totally agree. So let folks under the hood, what a normal week for a co-vocational pastor looks like. Sunday showing up and you're going to do your thing then, but how do you help them find that balance that you were talking about as they transition into this kind of new world?
Yeah, man. Well, the first thing is that, balance is an illusion because you can never perfectly balance everything. So in addition to being a co-vocational pastor for 7 years, a lead pastor here in the Bronx, and then I also have 3 children under 5. So they were all born after the church was planted. And I'm sure your listeners are well aware, New York City is not a place where people, work and, go out for 2-hour-long lunches and hit the golf club on Thursday afternoon and go to happy hour for 3 hours. It's a pretty intense place to live and to work. So one of the things that I often coach pastors through is wherever you are, just be fully there. If you're at work, just work. If you're at church doing church stuff, be at church doing church stuff. If you're with your kids, your wife, your husband, be with your kids, your wife, your husband. Just be fully present because it's so easy to get pulled in every sort of direction. And I try to do things like, from 1 to 3, I'm going to do this. From 2 to 5, I'm going to do that, whatever. The only thing I can say is that, it's easy to paint a rosy picture of co-vocational ministry, having, this day job plus leading your church. But I'll let pastors in on a little secret under the hood that for the first 2 years of being a bivocational, co-vocational pastor, I would get up at 5 o'clock every single morning to do church stuff. And then I'd go to work from 9 to 5. That was my life. So unless you're ready to make those kind of sacrifices, I definitely would not recommend this. It's not for the faint of heart. Didn't do that forever because I don't think I could have, but I did that for a good season of my life.
Are there stories of co-vocational, like team churches where they're just growing like nobody's business and they're not really paying anybody or maybe your part-time salary, etc.? Do you have some stories of churches that folks could look up and say, wow, here's a model to follow?
Yeah, there's two places I would recommend. The first, these are both Western United States examples. I'm sure you have an international audience, but here in the U.S., the Tampa Underground is a great one to look
Yes.
up. They're fantastic. They have books and they have a lot of like materials and assets you can look at and study. One is a little bit smaller. It's called the Creo Collective. They're based out of Pennsylvania. They're doing really fabulous work as well, very similar to Tampa Underground. And one of the things that's cool about both of these groups is that it's a decentralized model, right? So you might have a traditional Sunday morning church where people gather around and listen to some songs and a sermon, but you might also have a ministry that's to, bikers. You might have a ministry. They have one ministry in Creo Collective that literally their whole ministry is going to different Renaissance fairs all summer and ministering people in the Renaissance fair community. They have a nail salon that Christian owns and employs young girls and trains them on how to do nails. And this nail salon broke a whole sex trafficking ring in the state because they were ministering to these girls and hearing their stories. It's like stuff like that I think is really, really cool. And I mean, mine is stories a microcosm of both of those, but All Saints Church, in our 7 years of existence, planted another church in the Bronx with a bilingual Spanish-speaking pastor, another church in East New York, Brooklyn, with a Trinidadian pastor. And so 3 different congregations kind of sprung up, all of which co-vocational leaders, all expressions of community and faith that didn't exist prior, all because of the ability just to say, hey, you don't need $500,000 and a seminary degree to start a church. You need a few people who can go on mission together. And are these like large, glamorous, exciting churches? Not really. It might be 25 people on a Sunday morning, but I'll say it was 25 people that weren't gathering there before. I think God rejoices in that.
Amen. This is the future and the present right now. And I pray people really, really take that to heart. Let's close with a theological question. How is discipleship and evangelism connected? Because I think a lot of times they get bifurcated, right? But you planted a church that planted a church. It was born pregnant, and I bet that was in the plan. Well, the Holy Spirit's plan from the jump, right? So yeah, talk about discipleship and evangelism and the interconnection there.
Yeah, so I'll share 2 stories, and then thank you again for your time today, Tim. This was a lot of fun.
Right back at you.
The first story is that when I was being mentored to plant my own church, my mentor is a pastor named Rich, and he told me one time, if you get hit by a bus, right, I ride my bicycle around New York City every single day, so it's very likely. If you get hit by a bus, who's going to take over your church? And I said, I have no idea. He goes, well, you got to figure that out because it can't be the Eric Hoke show. It has to be, Jesus' show. So you have to figure out now who are you going to disciple, who you're going to train, who you're going to develop, that if God forbid something happens to you, the church continues. And that's something I think all pastors should consider, whether they bike around New York City or not, is this ministry going to die with me? So if so, that's a problem, and I should take this very seriously. So kind of begin thinking now, who's the people in my life that I can begin developing? I think that's the first story. Second story, man, discipleship and evangelism. One of my neighbors I live in a 5-story apartment building in the Bronx. One of my neighbors asked me in the mailroom, Eric, are you a member of the clergy class? I said, yeah, sure, you could say that. He's like, okay, do you mind if you and I sit down and talk about something I'm going through? I'm like, sure. So a few weeks later, I went to his apartment, we drank some seltzer water, and this guy just spilled his life story to me, good, bad, and ugly. Tears were shed, we prayed together. And this guy will probably never walk into a church because that's not part of his life. But he knew enough to know that there's a person in ministry who loves Jesus, who lives in my building I can talk to. And he's not the only person that I've had those conversations with in my neighborhood, which I think is really cool. And I think when pastors and ministry folks remove the mentality that ministry only happens in the 4 walls of the church, it opens the opportunity for God to work in our lives Monday through Sunday. And I think that's a really powerful thing. So what's the line between discipleship and evangelism? I mean, what was happening in that guy's apartment when he was praying and crying because of the sins that he's dealing with and hearing about Christ? I would say it was both. It was both evangelism and discipleship. Amen. So how do you untangle those two? I don't know, but I'm open to listening and learning. But for now, I'm just going to try to live with people and serve them the best I can.
Yeah, you're pastoring your community.
Yeah.
Right? And we need more of the baptized, the folks who say, I'm the everyday Christian, pastoring their neighborhood.
That's right.
Could there be a renaissance toward that in that direction, man? That's what I'm praying for. And this has been so much fun, Eric. I love your heart. You have blessed our listeners today immensely. If we got ihelppastorsgetjobs.com, you can hit Eric up there if his services could be of help to you. And your email, would you mind giving that out as well, Eric?
No, not at all. It's just my name, ERIC, at ihelppastorsgetjobs.com. And then also, if you download the free PDF on the website, that will kind of trigger you into a mailing list, so we can engage that way as well. You also can follow me on Twitter at my name, Eric Hoke.
Eric Hoke, the one and the only. Jesus is using you in a mighty way, man, and I am better for our time today. Sharing is caring. Please like, subscribe, comment wherever it is you're taking this in, whether it's on YouTube, Spotify, iTunes, wherever it is. I'm a Spotify guy. Where do you take in podcasts, Eric?
Spotify, man. Only Spotify.
Yeah. Only Spotify. So this is growing. This is a podcast, Unite Leadership Collective, uniteleadership.org. If we can help you in any way, it's a good day. Go make it a great day. Thanks so much, Eric. Appreciate it, man.
Thanks, Tim.